Most financial mistakes don't announce themselves when they happen. They feel like normal life, a reasonable decision made under reasonable circumstances by a person who had other priorities and no particular reason to believe that this specific choice would still be showing up in their finances 15 years later. That's what makes the mistakes made in your 20s different from most other financial errors. They don't hurt immediately. They compound quietly, in the background, while life moves forward and the connection between the original decision and its consequences becomes harder and harder to trace. By the time the damage is visible, in your 40s, when the retirement account should be substantial and isn't, when the mortgage feels heavier than expected, when the options feel narrower than your income would suggest, the decisions that caused it are long past. This isn't a list of things you shouldn't have enjoyed. It's a list of structural decisions, the kind that feel irrelevant at 23 and become defining at 43. The first mistake? Treating your 20s as a preview instead of the opening act. There's a widespread and expensive belief that the 20s are a warm-up decade. The real financial life starts later, when the career is established, when the salary is higher, when things have settled into something more permanent. This belief is mathematically devastating. Here's what the numbers say. $300 invested monthly starting at 22, at a 7% average annual return, becomes approximately $930,000 by age 65. The same $300 monthly starting at 32 becomes approximately $440,000. The same $300 monthly starting at 42 becomes approximately $185,000. Same amount, same return, same discipline, different starting point. The person who started at 22 didn't work harder than the person who started at 42. They didn't make better investment decisions. They made one decision earlier, and that single decade of head start is worth $745,000 by retirement. The 20s aren't the preview. They're the most valuable compounding decade you will ever have. Most people spend them waiting for things to feel more serious before treating them that way. The second mistake. Confusing lifestyle upgrades with financial progress. The first real salary feels transformative. After years of student budgets and entry-level income, money is finally arriving at a scale that feels like something changed. And for most people, it has. The apartment gets better, the car gets newer, the everyday standard recalibrates upward to match the new income. This is lifestyle inflation, and it's not irrational. The problem is that it masquerades as progress while eliminating the margin that would have produced actual progress. As income grows, lifestyle creep can quickly eat into raises or bonuses, leaving little room for savings or debt repayment. The mechanism is invisible precisely because every individual upgrade seems justified. The better apartment is practical. The newer car is reliable. The nicer restaurant is just occasional. What shows up in the 40s is the accumulated version of all those reasonable upgrades, a lifestyle structure that requires the full income to maintain, with almost nothing allocated toward building something durable underneath it. The person earning $90,000 at 45 with $60,000 in retirement savings isn't there because they didn't earn enough. They're there because every raise in their 20s and 30s became permanent overhead before it could become permanent investment. The third mistake. Carrying high-interest debt without urgency. Consumer debt in your 20s feels manageable in a way that turns out to be an illusion. A credit card balance of $5,000 doesn't feel like a crisis. The minimum payment is affordable. Life continues. What the minimum payment obscures is the actual cost of carrying that balance over time. At 24% annual interest, the current average for credit cards, a $5,000 balance paid down only at the minimum takes more than 20 years to clear and costs over $15,000 in total. The $5,000 purchase becomes a $15,000 purchase, paid in installments across 2 decades. The version that shows up in the 40s is more insidious. It's not one $5,000 balance, it's a decade of accumulated consumer debt, each individually manageable, collectively substantial. Nearly 3/4 of Americans failed to meet savings goals last year, according to a Vanguard survey. And a significant portion of that failure traces directly to debt service consuming the margin that should have been building assets. The interest on consumer debt and the compound growth on investments are running simultaneously. They're just running in opposite directions. The person who eliminates high-interest debt early wins both races at once. The fourth mistake. Not building an emergency fund before the emergencies arrive. This one is deceptively simple, which is probably why it gets skipped. An emergency fund sitting in a savings account earning modest interest doesn't feel like a financial strategy. It feels like money doing nothing. What it's actually doing is protecting every other financial decision from being derailed by predictable unpredictability. Without one, the car repair becomes a credit card balance. The credit card balance competes with the investment contribution. The investment contribution gets reduced or skipped. The compounding that should have happened doesn't. A single unexpected expense has cascaded through the entire financial system, and the damage compounds forward for years. The person who builds 3 to 6 months of expenses in a liquid account in their mid-20s converts potential crises into manageable inconveniences for the rest of their financial life. The person who never builds it pays for every emergency twice, once in the expense itself and once in the interest and disrupted compounding that follows. The fifth mistake: ignoring retirement accounts because retirement feels abstract. 23-year-olds are not good at internalizing the financial needs of their 65-year-old selves. This is not a character flaw. It's just how humans are wired. The present feels vivid, the distant future feels theoretical, and the competing demands of right now consistently win. The problem is that retirement accounts have a specific and irreplaceable feature: tax-advantaged compounding. Money growing inside a Roth IRA grows tax-free. Money growing inside a 401k grows tax-deferred. These advantages compound over time in the same way that interest compounds over time. The earlier the money enters the account, the more of the advantage gets captured. There's a more concrete version of this. A 22-year-old who contributes $6,000 to a Roth IRA and never contributes again will, at a 7% average annual return, have approximately $114,000 by age 65 from that single contribution. The same $6,000 contributed at 32 becomes approximately $57,000. At 42, it becomes approximately $29,000. The account doesn't care whether the person felt ready to invest. It just runs the math on when the money arrived. The sixth mistake: treating the employer match as optional. This is the most straightforward financial mistake on this list, and possibly the most costly in aggregate. An employer who matches 401k contributions is offering free money, unconditionally, as a benefit of employment. The match is typically 50 to 100% of contributions up to a defined limit. Not contributing enough to capture the full match is declining that free money, not deferring it, not saving it for later, declining it permanently. The employee who contributes 3% to capture a 3% employer match is effectively earning a 100% instant return on that portion of their income. No investment available anywhere produces a guaranteed 100% return. The employer match does. The version of this mistake that shows up in the 40s is an investment account that's substantially smaller than it would have been. Not because of poor investment decisions, but because years of free money were left on the table during the years when that money had the most time to compound. The seventh mistake: not tracking where the money actually goes. Most people in their 20s have a general sense of their finances. Income, rent, major expenses, the broad shape of it is clear. What's less clear is the accumulated total of the smaller, recurring, semi-invisible spending that fills the space between the known expenses and the end of the month. The subscriptions that auto-renew, the food delivery that became a default instead of an occasional convenience, the small purchases that don't register individually but add up to a number that would be surprising if anyone sat down and calculated it. Creating a realistic budget that tracks income and expenses gives visibility into cash flow and allows intentional allocation towards financial goals. But the more fundamental point is that spending you can't see, you can't decide about. The money doesn't disappear into bad decisions. It disappears into the absence of decisions, which is a different thing and in some ways more expensive. The version that shows up in the 40s is a person who earned well for 20 years and is genuinely uncertain where a significant portion of it went. The income was there, the tracking wasn't. The eighth mistake: optimizing for salary instead of skill development in early career choices. This one runs counter to what feels financially sensible. When you're 23 and making $40,000, a job that offers $48,000 feels like obvious progress. Take the money. The problem is that the 20s are the only decade when the decision about what you're learning is more valuable than the decision about what you're earning. The compounding that matters most in that period isn't financial. It's the compounding of skills, relationships, and domain expertise that will determine what your earning ceiling looks like in your 30s and 40s. The person who takes the higher salary at a company that teaches them nothing has optimized for the short timeline. The person who takes the lower salary at a company that develops rare skills has optimized for the long one. These two people will look identical at 25 and dramatically different at 35. Not because of luck, but because of what the early career choices were accumulating. The financial version of this mistake shows up in the 40s as an income that plateaued earlier than expected, in a role that stops developing the person long before the person was aware it had. The ninth mistake: making large financial commitments before understanding the full cost. Cars, apartments, credit agreements. The initial decision is based on the number that's visible: the monthly payment, the rent, the purchase price. The full cost includes maintenance, insurance, opportunity cost, and the way each commitment reduces the margin available for everything else. A car payment of $450 per month doesn't just cost $450 per month. It costs $450 per month plus insurance, plus maintenance, plus the compounding growth that $450 would have produced if it had been invested instead. Over 5 years, the total financial impact of that car payment, when opportunity cost is included, often exceeds the original purchase price of the vehicle. The version that shows up in the 40s is a financial structure built on a series of these decisions, each individually defensible, collectively expensive in ways that were never fully calculated at the time. The question worth asking before any significant financial commitment isn't only, can I afford the payment? It's, what is this commitment closing off? Margin closes slowly. It takes years to notice. But it shows up clearly in the 40s, when the options that should be available aren't. Not because of bad luck, but because of accumulated commitments that consumed the space where options live. These 9 mistakes share a single quality. None of them felt like mistakes when they happened. They felt like life, ordinary, reasonable, circumstantially justified decisions made by people who had no particular reason to believe that this specific moment was a financial turning point. That's precisely why they compound so effectively. The financial damage doesn't begin the day the mistake is made. It begins the day the compounding window opens on the alternative, the investment that wasn't started, the debt that wasn't cleared, the margin that wasn't protected, and starts quietly accumulating a gap that only becomes visible later. In your 20s, the gap is still small. The decisions that created it are still recent. The window to change the trajectory is still wide open. In your 40s, the gap is the difference between options and obligations, between choosing your work and needing your income, between a retirement that works and one that requires adjustment. The mistakes that live in your 40s were almost always made in your 20s. The good news is the reverse is also true.